It did not take long into my teaching career to realize that my students had no clue how to prepare for tests. And while I know some schools are moving away from tests as summative assessments, I still feel like there is a role for tests at the completion of a unit. And I think they are really helpful, especially if you're helping prepare your students for end of course exams or other standardized tests. So I knew after a little time in the classroom, like I needed to teach my students how to study. And for me, that means teaching them how to create and use study guides effectively, because that is just something they had no concept of. Because I think when people traditionally think of a study guide, they just think of a tool where, a teacher will take bullet points and like list out key topics that a student needs to study. Or maybe you picture from maybe your middle school days, like a teacher who literally took a review guide and made it fill in the blank. And then you just had to fill in words and like, oh, I completed my study guide. Those are the kind of things we envision. But like that is not necessarily what's appropriate for a high school student. And so through a lot of trial and error, I feel like I developed a system for using study guides that was really effective. It was effective for my students and for me, and it really helped to prepare them not only to be successful in my class and on my assessments, but also just for any future situation they would be in where they would need to study for something. And so in today's episode, we're going to do a deep dive into study guides. I'm going to share with you more on why I do them, how I do them, what my students' role is in the study guide formation, when my students are doing study guides, how I grade them and go over them with students, and then lastly, how to motivate students to do them, especially when they are really opposed. So let's dive in. This is Secondary Science Simplified, a podcast for secondary science teachers who want to engage their students and simplify their lives. I'm Rebecca Joyner from It's Not Rocket Science. As a high school science teacher turned curriculum writer, I am passionate about helping other science teachers love their jobs, serve their students, and do it all in only 40 hours a week. Are you ready to rock the time you spend in your classroom and actually have a life outside of it? You are in the right place, teacher friend. Let's get to today's episode. So at the end of last year, a teacher reached out to me and said that they were really interested in hearing more about how I have students create their own study guides, because this teacher really wanted their students to have stronger study habits, but felt like their students just did not see the value in studying or reviewing or doing anything like this out of class. And so I was discoursing with this teacher and I was like, I cannot believe I've not done a podcast episode on this. So I'm excited to kind of devote this entire episode to this concept because I think it's really important. And so here's why I teach my students how to do study guides. It's because our students need to know how to study. This is a muscle that they have to exercise just like any muscle in order for it to get stronger. And no matter what they do outside of high school, studying will be a part of any sort of higher education or job that they will do that has any sort of training or testing. You need to study to get a captain's license to run a boat. You need to study for an esthetician license, a mortgage license, a real estate license, of course, for a college degree. I feel like there are things you have to study if you're a stay-at-home mom and you find out that your child has type 1 diabetes or has a learning disability and you're having to accommodate all these different things. We have to learn and memorize and study in every aspect of our lives. And so it's such a critical time to teach our high school students this lifelong skill that they will use whether they go on to college or not. Also, I know for me personally, and I'm going to make a jump here and assume you feel the same. I'm guessing you want your summative assessments to authentically assess what your students know. And while I'm not one to give my students the questions in advance, I definitely don't want them to be surprised by any question. They should never walk out of my classroom after a test and be like, I had no idea number 17 was going to be on the test, or that was totally out of left field. Absolutely not. Everything they see should be familiar and it should be aligned to what I've been teaching them in class. And this is one reason I think that my curriculum design method is so effective. And there are a lot of things that I don't do well, but I think one of my greatest strengths as a curriculum writer is the fact that I write lessons and unit plans holistically. I'll show you what I mean. I'll link my units and curricula in the show notes so you can see, but I write all of it at once. So I'm not just like writing lecture notes and then labs and then practice and then a test. Like I'm doing the whole thing is integrated, and I'm constantly going back and forth throughout all my instructional resources and my tests to make sure it all is aligned so that everything supports each other, so that a student will never get to the test and be like, I had no idea that this was going to be on here. There shall never be a surprise. So my study guides, they serve my students by helping me teach them how to study, but they also serve me as the teacher because they act as like a barometer so that I can know that I'm actually teaching my students the things that I'm going to be assessing them on. But they're only effective at accomplishing both of those goals if they are done well. So here is how I do them, and I train my students to do them. I think it really comes down to 4 things. So first, I think you need to write the study guide as you lesson plan for your units. So that's what I was saying about my holistic lesson planning and curriculum writing strategy. I make the outline for the unit on the front cover page of my packet for the unit, and that serves as the student study guide. And I am writing that as I'm writing the unit, as I'm coming up with the lecture notes and the labs and the inquiry activities and all of that. So I'm making sure that everything that we're doing in class to learn aligns with something on this study guide. And then when I get to writing the test for the end of the unit, when I'm writing that summative assessment, I go back to the study guide again and I tweak it to make sure that every single question on the test aligns with something on the study guide. And if it doesn't, I add it to the study guide. And then if I see like, oh, well, I need some instructional resources to support learning this, then I add those in too. It's so important that you write the test, if you are able, before your unit begins. Because how can you effectively hit your goals within a unit if you haven't set them yet? Like then you're just arbitrarily throwing resources at a target, and the target is a moving target because it hasn't been established yet. So you're creating the study guide as you're writing your assessment for the unit, and you're doing this all before you teach the unit. And I make my study guides, they're not just like bullet points of topics, and they're not just test questions, okay? It's more than bullet points and way less than copied and pasted test questions. What I do are 2 things. I list objectives for each concept I'm teaching, which are what do I hope the students will know or be able to do as they learn this concept and by the end of the unit. And then I list essential vocabulary terms that I think they need to be able to define and understand in order to be successful with showing their understanding of this concept. Now, a third thing that's kind of like a bonus for quantitative sciences, so for chemistry and physical science, is I'll have a section labeled like practice. And these are just more like quantitative science skills, like practicing some math things that they might just need to have example problems of, like, hey, these are the types of problems you might see on the test. So objectives, vocabulary, and sometimes practice questions. And then the 4th thing that's so important is that I'm giving my students a study guide on the first day of the unit, if possible. The earlier, the better, because then from day 1 of the unit, they know what is expected. They know where the target is. They know where we are going. And it gives them plenty of time to complete the study guide throughout the 4 to 8 weeks of the unit. And it encourages them to do what we all want them to do, which is to study throughout the unit rather than cramming the night before. How can we expect our students to not cram the night before a test if we're just giving them the study guide 2 or 3 days in advance? Like, of course they're going to be cramming. We have to give it to them early. And again, that's another reason why I'm obsessed with my packet strategy. It's the way that I organize all of my instructional resources. But essentially at the start of the unit, I give my students a packet. The cover page is the outline for the unit, which is their study guide. It breaks the unit into concepts, and each concept has objectives and essential vocabulary. And then after that, it has their notes outlines. It has the practice handouts, the labs, the projects, everything that they need. So they know exactly what we're doing and where we're going, and that their teacher, Miss Joyner, knows the target, and we are on a straightaway direct flight path to get to that target. I will link episode 60 in the show notes, which is all about teaching with packets and more about what they are and how I structure them and why I love them and all that jazz. Okay, so that's how I do them and kind of set it up. Here's what my students actually do. I keep my study guides extremely simple. I want my students to just provide enough of an answer to the question or enough support for the objective that it's clear what they need to know and be able to do, but not too much that they're just having to like do a bunch of repetitive things. So I make the outline for them. I take the unit and I divide it into 3 to 6 concepts. And again, underneath each of those concepts, I will list out objectives and essential vocabulary. So for example, for my electricity and magnetism unit in my physical science curriculum, there are 4 concepts in that unit. We cover electric charge, electric current, circuits, and magnets. So I have the cover page of the packet has 4 columns, 1 for each of those concepts. And then I list out all the objectives, what I hope students will know or be able to do by the end of the unit. Usually there's anywhere from 5 to 10 of those. And then I list out the essential vocabulary, the words that they need to be able to define in order to understand the content. And again, this is the cover page now for my unit packet. They get it on day 1. And the students know, and I train them that for their study guides, they are going to make a study guide for each concept. So for that electricity and magnetism unit, there's going to be 4 little study guides, 1 for each concept. And for their study guide, they do 2 things. They answer all of the objectives, so they have to write something for the objectives, and they define all the vocabulary. Now, if there are any practice questions, they'll have to do those also. And if any objective is italicized, I don't make them write anything for those, but that's a way that I notate the objectives that are kind of like skills, where it's like, hey, you're going to need to be able to do stuff like this. Like you're going to need to be able to analyze data and draw conclusions from it. And there's not really something they could be able to write on a study guide to show that they can do that, but I want them to make sure they know like that's going to be a skill that they need to have. And then from there, that's it. Students get complete freedom to format these however is most helpful for them. Some type, some handwrite, some make flip charts, some make flashcards, some use Quizlet. Like they can do whatever they want. Some may just doodle and do all these visual illustrations. Some just write things in bullets. Like I don't care because I just want them to make what is going to be the most helpful for them as they study. And this is where they kind of start to like add in their personality and learn what their personal preferences are and what helps them best learn. I learn really well from like color coding. So I'm doing a ton of color coding. My only rule for them is they cannot write in paragraph form because no one's studying just like paragraphs of text. No one's doing that. And when I'm writing the objectives, I try to include questions that say things like create a Venn diagram or make a chart or, compare and contrast so that they are encouraged then to use some things, draw some pictures to symbolize things. So again, that their study guide is very, very visual. It's so important that we encourage them to make study guides in a format that is most useful to them. It's not going to be effective if they just make something to check the box because you asked them to make a study guide. It needs to be something that they will actually refer back to and use. Now, most honor students can just take this and run with it. My lower level students do need some more support, especially with the first one. So model it. Block off half a class period. And I have this very simple 1-pager called How to Write a Great Study Guide. I'll link it in the show notes. You can just grab it. It's like a PDF, but print that out so students have access to that. It has a lot of the things I'm saying just typed out. And then I would pull up the cover page of my unit packet that is their objectives and vocabulary. That's what they're making their study guides from. I'd pull that up on my whiteboard and I'd be like, okay, everyone get out a piece of paper. And then I would write on my other whiteboard and we'd start walking through some of these together and doing it together. Like, how could we answer this question? And what's a way we could do it in a visually appealing way that we can study from this together? And you do it with them. That is going to help them so much. And it's going to help them see that it doesn't have to take that long to do each of these study guides. Now, when are students actually doing them? I've mentioned in previous episodes, even last week, that I don't assign any homework to my students. The only thing they are expected to do is their study guides. So there's anywhere from like 3 to 4 per unit, and they're very small. Like I said, typically 5 to 10 objectives, and then, anywhere from 1 to 10 vocabulary terms they're defining. They're not crazy. But I knew that when I eliminated homework, I was going to have to build in more class time for students to do reinforcing practice and things like that. And so I did, but in turn, some students finished early. And so any students that finish early can always just work on their study guide. And I try to build in a little bit of time for that too. Also, other students would come after school to tutoring and just sit there and be like, hey, can I make my study guide in here while you're grading or working just so I can be near you and I can ask you questions as I do it? And I'm like, absolutely. And it was just such a great balance because they knew also it kept them motivated in class because if I finish my lab and I stay on task, then I'll have extra time to work on my study guide and I won't have to ever do it at home. So that's kind of when my students were doing it. Some were doing it at home, but most were doing them in class. And anytime they finished early, again, if they started getting off task or distracting their neighbors, I'm like, start working on your next study guide because there was kind of always one that they could be doing. Okay, let's talk about how I grade them and go over them. And I have switched this up. I do different things for different groups. It's totally based on the dynamic of the group. So I'll kind of share the two overall ways that I did this. So first is if you have a more independent group, you can just encourage them throughout the unit. Be like, hey, make sure you're working on your study guides. Make sure you're working on your concept study guides. And then, on your review day or near the end of your unit, have a day where you're going to spot check all of them for completion and then go over them in class. If you use any of my It's Not Rocket Science units, there is a PowerPoint study guide answer key in the keys subfolder of the packets folder for every unit. So you can project that and then just go over it and they can just self-grade their own. So that's one option. Now, if your students need a little bit more handholding because they're going to cram and just do things last minute and rush and copy each other, and you want to hold them a little bit more accountable, you can collect the study guides throughout the unit. That's what I tend to recommend. So for instance, after we've kind of finished concept 1, usually the next day or 2 days later, I'll have the concept 1 study guide due and I'll collect it. And then, after we finish concept 2, I'll have the concept 2 study guide due. And I don't have a rubric or anything like that I use to grade it, but all I'll do is I'll just go through them and I will just very quickly scan them for accuracy. And any objective that isn't answered fully or right, or any vocabulary word that's not accurately defined, I'll just circle it. And then in the margin, I'll just take off partial credit, a half point or 1 point or whatever. I make these very low stakes, 10 points per concept. That helps also make it if you're actually doing it with integrity and not copying someone's, it's a low stakes thing again. But I'm just marking things and then I'll be like, okay, you got a 7 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 or whatever. I'm not correcting them because I want them to see oh, you missed this. And then that encouraged them to come in for after school tutoring for help or to ask me for some clarifying questions. And then they do the work of correcting it on their own. I think that's really important. So I collect them and then I try to return them the next day so they have them to correct and to be studying. And then, at the end of the unit, we might do some more review as a class as a whole. But again, that's totally your preference. You don't have to collect them throughout the unit. You don't have to grade them at all. You can grade for accuracy. You can grade for completion. It's totally up to you and what your students need to help with their motivation. I know when I taught AP biology, I didn't check or grade study guides at all. I gave them the outline. I said, you need to be making study guides from this. And I just expected them to do it. But it was obviously a highly motivated group. Also, my AP biology students, I had most of them already for physical science and biology. So they saw the value in making these study guides. Now, here's what I will say, because you might be freaking out. There's no chance that I can be creating these study guide outlines and the test before the unit starts. I'm barely keeping up with my lesson plan. So how am I supposed to get this to them early and be this planned? Here's what I'll say. First, you can always outsource, and It's Not Rocket Science and a million other curriculum writers could help you. But second, I'll say this. When I taught AP biology the first time, I was maybe 1 to 2 weeks ahead of my AP students in terms of lesson planning. I had 5 preps. One of them was AP bio. I was drowning. Okay, so I was definitely not batching and planning ahead and aligning my assessments like I would ideally be doing and like I do in all my other courses. But I still gave them a unit outline early. I still made one based on what I thought was going to go down and what I thought they needed to know. And then as things happen throughout the unit, I would be like, hey, add this to your unit outline, add this to your study guide so you can make a study guide from it. And I would tweak mine as we went too. It was a live working document. You could even just make it a Google Doc and not print it for them so that it can be live and you can add to it. And then also like in AP Bio, I curved the test for a lot of reasons. One, because I only used released College Board questions. So they were hard and the AP test is curved. So why would I not curve my in-class tests? But two, it also helped to make up for the fact that like I may not have like well prepared them for it or like perfectly aligned everything like I have in my other curriculum that I've written from scratch and done every single part of it. And then of course, like as I'm writing the test, I'm editing it too. So it was more of like a working live document. But all that to say, that was an AP group, so it felt different. I would really be doing my best to make the time to plan ahead this far for your lowest level students that need the most support and they need the most runway time to get these kinds of things done and have the space to do it. And I would definitely give those students the due dates throughout the unit to get them done and hold them accountable. So as we wrap up this episode, I want to share a few ways that I motivate students to do them. First, like I mentioned, is grading them. Whether that's checking for completion at the end of the unit or collecting and grading for accuracy, grading them will create some motivation. I think the most effective is if you collect them by concept throughout the unit and grade them for accuracy and return them. That seems to have worked really well with my students. The second thing I think that is so important is you can do this after every test, but especially your first one, the first test you have after implementing study guides. When you're going over the test, I want you to have students pull out the unit outline, which is their cover page of their packet, which they've used to make their study guide from, that has the list of objectives and vocabulary. I want them to have that out, and then I want them to have your test out. And I want them to see how every test question aligns with something on that unit outline, on that cover page of the packet that they made their study guides from. I make it a game, okay? Like, okay, this question, which objective or vocabulary term does it align with? And we find it all. And then it helps them to visually see like, oh, this is all directly correlated. And it eliminates any of that, oh, you never taught us this statements. Because they can see that, oh, if I take the study guide seriously, like every single thing on here is going to help me be successful on the unit test. And maybe you even surprise them at some time too and let them have a unit test where they're allowed to use their study guide. Like that's an option too, because it'll help them see the importance of making good study guides. And they'll realize like, oh, it's not just making it, but then I have to actually like read through it over and over again to study from it. Now, the last thing I'll say to motivate them is some students have complained that they're tedious and they don't need them. And so here's what I've kind of done for those groups. I find that most in like the honors groups that they just don't want to do them because they just kind of want to do their own studying thing. Maybe they have their own way of studying. That's fine. In those years with those groups of students, I have a rule that if you make an A, like on the Unit 1 test, then you will not be required to do study guides for the Unit 2 test. And I'll go in the grade book as I'm inputting their grades for the Unit 1 test, and I'll go in for Unit 2, and I'll just go ahead and mark an X to exempt them so it doesn't hurt them or help them. And then if they make less than an A on the Unit 2 test, then they're back to being required to do study guides. Because again, the goal is to give them a tool that effectively helps them to study for their test. If they have their own methods and don't need my method, then that's fine by me. But I found this really motivating for my honor students who felt like the study guides were busy work and they didn't need to do them. Like, okay, go off. If you can show me you don't need them, then you don't have to make them. And then others still chose to make them, even when they did make A's, because they're like, well, also, it helps me and it's an easy grade. It's like an easy 10 out of 10 for me. And I was like, okay, great, do it. So that's another thing that I found motivating for that group. The last thing I want to address before I let y'all go is those of you who might be thinking, well, what if my students are just using AI to make their study guides? And my question for you would be like, okay, so what if they do? And here's why I say that. If you look at Bloom's taxonomy, analyzing and evaluating are higher levels. They are more challenging than remembering, understanding, and applying. So actually, if they're using ChatGPT to make their study guides, in a sense, it could be harder and more stretching for them because they're going to have to evaluate what ChatGPT makes to make sure, one, it's correct. It does things wrong all the time. Two, that it actually answers the objectives and questions. And three, that it's actually something that's helpful for them on their tests. So yes, they could input these things into ChatGPT and have ChatGPT spit something out for them, but it may still need a lot of editing and tweaking. And I think that's still a useful way for them to use their time. And then they still end up with a tool that they can then study from. And to me, that's the whole point of it. Now, if you want to help kind of decrease that, you can require that they handwrite their study guides. again, they could still use ChatGPT, but then at least they're having to like transpose it and write it. And there is scientific research that backs up that like manually writing something down does help with their memory and learning things. So that's an option too. But I would not get my panties in a wad about them using AI to make the study guides. I feel like, okay, that's you being resourceful and using tools. But as long as you're making a study guide that's actually accurate and that answers these objectives fully and that you're going to study from, then I'm personally fine with it. And again, that goes back to making the grade really low stakes, like just a 10-pointer. So like, who cares if you used AI or not? You know what I mean? So that is all my thoughts about study guides. I hope it's helpful. I hope it makes sense. If you go to the show notes, I'll try to make sure to upload some like examples. I'll upload that how to write a great study guide sheet just so you can kind of have some visuals. And I'll also link any relevant podcast episodes that will help support you in that as well. And you can find the show notes at itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/episode 219. All right, teacher friends, that wraps up today's episode. If you're looking for an easy way to start simplifying your life as a secondary science teacher, head to itsnotrocketscienceclassroom.com/challenge to grab your classroom reset challenge. And guess what? It's totally free. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you here next week. Until then, I'll be rooting for you, teacher friend.